Absolutely.
So for everyone who's joined us, I think we're going to try and touch on the latest developments on James Comey, the Tish James indictment, the Supreme Court's rejection of the hearing the Alex Jones appeal, what's going on, what the Supreme Court is doing today around the Voters Registration Act. And I think we also have breaking news right on lawsuit, another Epstein lawsuit, right, against Bank
Absolutely.
of
Yeah. A
America.
pair of Epstein lawsuits that was just filed, actually just reported on it. It's part of a series of Epstein lawsuits against major banks. In the beginning, when these lawsuits started coming, it was filed against Deutsche Bank and JP Morgan Chase. Those lawsuits ended in enormous settlements. The next two banks within the sights of Epstein survivors are Bank of New York Mellon and Bank of America. And reading through the complaints is really fascinating because you see both complaints are brought by Sigrid McCauley and David Boies, who
Yep.
are prominent lawyers for the Epstein survivors. But on top of who brought it, it shows what has developed from the investigation, what has sparked from the investigation, the Senate investigation of Senator Ron Wyden, who I've spoken to on
Yes.
Substack and elsewhere. But he's been pulling this thread, the follow the money thread, for a very long time. And you can see that investigation cited in both lawsuits, particularly noting in the Bank of America lawsuit, for example, that Leon Black, the billionaire who paid Jeffrey Epstein $170,000 for tax and estate.
Million.
A million. I meant million. Excuse me. What a
Yeah.
week. Yeah, $170 million. The kind of rates that, you know, financial consulting for tax and estate planning don't usually go up to that figure. And but that was through a Bank of America account. And those are one of the red flags according to the lawsuit. The lawsuit says, why didn't they scrutinize that? It was a lawsuit filed by a Jane Doe plaintiff. Have
Right.
you dug
Yeah.
into that yet?
So, well, here's what I have. So the B of A one, I haven't read the complaint yet. I saw, is it the Journal, I think, who broke this? So I saw their story on it. And so what I've seen that seems interesting is this Jane Doe met Epstein in 2011 in
Correct.
Russia. Okay,
Yes.
so for me, that sends off all sorts of, bells in my head because, one of the things that Epstein claimed in the last decade of his life was that one of his clients was Vladimir Putin. And of course, no one knows, or very few people, can stand that up. But the fact he was actually in Russia in 2011 is interesting. And then it seems, I think the other thing that was interesting to me was that he opened a bank account for this woman who presumably moved to the United States at his request or something. He opened the bank account for her. $14,000, am I right? Was paid in.
That's right.
He paid
Into
that
this
into
new
the
account.
Right. And then the other thing that I was very interested in is the Leon Black connection. Because what Discovery has shown through emails in other civil lawsuits is that one of the reasons JP Morgan, big competitor to Bank of America, one of the reasons that bankers there continued to meet with Jeffrey Epstein, even after, there all sorts of red flags had gone off, etc., was because they believed he was a conduit to Leon Black. And I've always found that to be a complete head scratcher. Leon Black is one of the wealthiest men in America. Why did he need Jeffrey Epstein to be a conduit to JP Morgan. But I actually had not really clocked that Bank of America was the vehicle through which Leon Black paid Jeffrey Epstein $170 million.
Right. No, that was a eye-popping detail from the lawsuit. That
Well,
and the details about the Jane Doe from Russia, that the allegations regarding her are fascinating because they say that some of this money was used in order to sort out immigration issues, and they allege immigration fraud. Now, there's a similar lawsuit that this ties into because they say that one of the vehicles of that alleged fraud was Richard Kahn, one of the
right.
executors of Jeffrey Epstein's estate. So you have in a similar lawsuit in the Southern District of New York, the survivors suing the executors of Epstein's estate, Richard Kahn and Darren Indike.
That's
And
right.
and that's
Yeah.
one of the central allegations that this entire thing, especially when it came to survivors and victims who were brought in internationally from places like Russia and elsewhere, that in order to keep them in the country, there were complicated schemes to defraud immigration authorities, including sham marriages, it's alleged in the other lawsuit. So like the other lawsuits against the financial institutions, you're sort of seeing the kind of accounting and legal architecture that's said to be behind this whole scheme. The a detail we haven't even spoken about Bank of New York Mellon yet,
Mm.
that one, the detail in that lawsuit that I find fascinating, and I want to see what litigation reveals, is about the connection between Jeffrey Epstein and Jean-Luc Brunel, and that the bank of choice for the company that they co-founded. Now, Jean-Luc Brunel is a French modeling scout who was,
Yeah.
like Epstein, prosecuted for child sex crimes, died before trial in jail.
In jail. Yeah.
In jail in very similar circumstances, did not go to trial, that would have gone into this MC2 kind of conflation of MC squared with Epstein and Brunel, and that this entity, according to the lawsuit, operated through BNY. So here we have two different lawsuits getting at this is what Senator Ron Wyden calls a follow the money investigation, because we haven't had a trial with Jean-Luc Brunel because he died before trial. We haven't had any kind of reckoning over how did the international facilitation
Mm.
of victims from places like France, like Russia. How did that happen? I know over the course of the J.P. Morgan and the Deutsche Bank litigation, we found all sorts of details about what the banks knew over the course of discovery. Now, if they can get past that motion to dismiss, that's another avenue for
Right.
new information to come out of major subjects that have been a dead end in the Jeffrey Epstein
Right.
investigation.
Because I know that is it the JP Leon Black for sure settled, I want to say, with the US Virgin Islands. Because
Uh,
so that it was
I believe the executors of the state, that the Indike and Khan settled with the Virgin Islands. Is that in addition?
no, I mean everyone we need, because these are complicated things and we don't want to get it wrong.
Yes,
But I'm pretty sure that the reason we haven't heard Leon Black's testimony, and lots of people, Senator Wyden has subpoenaed him, but he's not compelled, right, to
absolutely.
answer that. So I don't want to misspeak, but I am fairly sure that I have even reported this. I'm going to look this up and we can continue talk because
But
it
yeah,
is very interesting. Adam, so what's the jurisdiction that the lawyers have sued Is it New York?
But both in the Southern District of New York.
In
So
the
this
Southern
is all going
District.
to pan out in Lower Manhattan. It's all going to be, and this is what I think will be fascinating about this, because again, as I said, we never got that trial with Jean-Luc Brunel, and saw how those international networks operated, and the fact that the plaintiff met uh, Jeffrey Epstein in Russia, and how the immigration piece of this puzzle worked out. It's just this avenue for public understanding. It's just something that has never been
Right.
unraveled on a kind of sheer mechanics level. And to your point, Senator Ron Wyden has done amazing work
Yeah.
in his investigation, but there's something about the power of a court to penetrate, to compel subpoenas and testimony that will be able to unravel more details
And
in
so
this step.
yes. And so I have a question, by the way. So I'm reading I Was Right.
Yeah. Oh,
In
okay.
January 2023, Leon Black agreed to pay $62.5 million to the US Virgin Islands to be released from any potential claims arising out of the territory's 3-year investigation into the sex trafficking operation of Jeffrey Epstein, according to a copy of the settlement agreement. So that did happen. I'm reading there from the New York Times report in 2023. And it was after the Virgin Islands reached a $105 million deal with Mr. Epstein's estate, and before the Virgin Islands then sued JP Morgan. So it's all, these are all concentric circles. My next, and I just want everyone who's tuned in to remember, just think about this in context. 2011, Jeffrey Epstein is in Russia finding this Jane Doe, and one has to assume others, because I've reported that one of the things that was striking in Jeffrey Epstein's last decade, a contrast with the previous 15, 20 years of his life, was that he tended the girls he surrounded himself with in the last decade of his life after he'd got out of prison and was a convicted sex offender, was he deliberately chose Eastern Europeans. And one of the reasons for that is, culturally, he believed they had a different view of men and the age of consent, and a lot of these girls had experienced horrendous things done to them very early on in their lives, the age of sort of 11 or 12, by older men in their countries. And so, some of them had a benign view of Jeffrey Epstein, because unlike the men in their home countries, he paid them. Yes, they had to do unspeakable acts to him, but he paid them to go to school or to, go to the doctor. He paid their rent. And so, that was the sort of twisted factor, but I had not ever really, I had assumed that the girls would already be here. The idea that he's in Russia is fairly extraordinary.
Right. Well, it reminds me of him boasting of one of his former quote unquote assistants, Nadia Marchenkova, that he purchased her from her parents in the former Yugoslavia. It was this thing that it was a kind of sick boast, and it's changed the public understanding of who some of his so-called assistants were. That could they be counted as, along with his victims. And so the kind of international scope of his sex trafficking network, that's something that I think that the follow the money investigation that Wyden is doing, that these lawsuits are focusing on, really helps illuminate, because he's not just, this isn't simple tourism. This is, These are networks, and so I'm very interested to see where the Jean-Luc Brunel piece of the puzzle leads in the Bank of New York Mellon Bank of New York Mellon lawsuit. I'm very interested to see what the Bank of America litigation illuminates. How many other there's just we only know Jane Doe's story from this lawsuit. It's filed as a
Right.
class action. Will we see anything else about other operations in Eastern Europe, in Russia, if this is pushed forward for past dismissal and goes on to discovery? That did happen before there was a settlement in the J.P. Morgan case and the
Yeah.
Deutsche Bank case. They made it past dismissal. There was intensive discovery. We found out all of these communications, including all the way up to Jamie Dimon, who was forced to testify in that case. And so I think that that the filing of these lawsuits is very significant in the public's understanding of this. Who knows? Right now, we could have a situation where Arizona's new representative is finally sworn in, and there's a rush of information about Epstein that was in the possession of the federal government. But even before that, even when that happens, there's more to be learned about the legal architecture. That's the stuff
Yeah.
that's just
Well,
such
so
an important piece of the puzzle.
so that's my next question, actually, Adam, not having yet read the complaint, is obviously in Jeffrey Epstein's world of the plutocracy, $14,000 is peanuts, right? So I'm assuming that, and you mentioned at the beginning that this is connected to this other lawsuit that David Boies and Brad Edwards have, and that's going against Darren Indyke, and what's his name, Khan.
Yeah. Yes, Richard Kahn.
They both Richard Khan, who are and Darren Indyke was Jeffrey Epstein's really long-term lawyer. So there weren't any of these agreements signed without Darren Indyke knowing about them. And I think Richard Khan has been in the orbit for a long time. So it's not surprising to me that David Boies and Sigrid McCauley and Brad Edwards were suing Darren Indyke and Richard Khan separately. I mean, the trickiness here legally, right, is that they are the administrators of the Epstein estate. And so they got immunity, right, in order to disperse funds to the victims who came to the Epstein Compensation Fund, Victims Fund, I believe it was called. So they presumably thought they were free and clear, but no. Or not free and clear from lawsuits. So why is this B of A and the Bank of Mellon, New York? Why are they helpful? Why did David Boies and co need these separate lawsuits?
Well, it's hard to put myself in the mind and litigation strategy of the lawyers, but I will say this: there's this. From reading the lawsuits, you see a trajectory that it builds upon the knowledge that has arisen from discovery in the prior cases, that without the case against Darren Indyke and Richard Kahn, they don't learn certain details that enhance the understanding.
Got
And same thing with, Senator Wyden's investigation is cited and footnoted in both lawsuits. So it seems that they're learning information, they're following a thread, and they pull on that thread to
it.
where it leads. And they're saying with this lawsuit, hey, it leads to Bank of America, it leads
Got
to Bank of New York Mellon, and that that if they have enough to sustain that complaint, they can find new information. And that's the thing that it gets this, the sex trafficking network. What is the
Yeah.
network? What were all of the lawsuits against the banks allege that the banks ignored clear red flags that, there's this $170 million transaction where one of the parties to this transaction had been convicted of child sex crimes in the state of Florida. There was quite a bit of journalism about him. Why didn't you question that? And did you not question it because one of them was a billionaire and the other one was
Yep.
rehabilitating his reputation in the company of billionaires and other powerful clients that you wanted
Right.
to land? And that was one of the successful arguments in the early stages of the Deutsche Bank litigation and the JP Morgan litigation. And it seems like they are following the same initial steps. They're taking pieces of information that they've learned from prior investigations. And by the way, the Deutsche Bank litigation and the JP Morgan litigation wouldn't have been possible if not for, as you mentioned, the Virgin Islands
Right.
investigations.
Right.
That they're all building and pointing to
Yeah.
directions until they feel that they have sufficient evidence to file a lawsuit. So I think they're being deliberate. It's a very slow process, but it's a process where I feel they're making real gains in the
Right.
public's understanding of this in a way that
Right.
doesn't, it's interesting. This particular side of the Epstein case isn't very flashy. It doesn't get a lot of attention because we're not yet talking about a former president, a head of state.
Right.
It's not. It doesn't fill the bold-faced names of columns. We have mentioned Leon Black. We've mentioned the executors of the estate. It's something that helps illuminate how it happened. How does Jeffrey
Yeah.
Epstein pay hundreds of dollars at a time, seemingly every day over the course of years,
Right.
to girls and women and transfer $14,000 in service of to a woman from Russia who's getting help with them, and then illuminating the shell companies and finding out how it happens.
Yeah.
It's a key piece of the puzzle,
Well,
but it's a kind of actuarial piece of the puzzle that
no, well,
doesn't
I agree.
command
But
the
in
same
order to
attention.
understand it, you and I have talked about this. I mean, and I know, and you've done brilliant reporting, particularly around the Senator Wyden's very important role in all of this. But in order to understand Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking scheme, you have to understand the money part of it. We've always said that, and so for people tuning in, I mean, the reason David Boyes and Sigrid Macaulay names are even attached to this lawsuit goes back to someone whose memoir is being published next week, and I'm talking about Virginia Roberts Giuffre, whose posthumous memoir is being published on Tuesday, and that I'm sure will have some bold-faced names that we may not have heard before in connection to Jeffrey Epstein. But it was so Brad Edwards was the Florida lawyer who was representing many Epstein victims in a class action suit because the victims weren't consulted, which is illegal. When Alex Acosta gave Jeffrey Epstein the sweetheart plea deal and allowed him to plead guilty to the state crimes, not the federal crimes. Well, the problem with all of that were that the people who weren't consulted were the victims. Brad Edwards was a Florida lawyer who then represented this class action suit. And it was when Virginia Roberts Giuffre, with her, who's with her extraordinary stories of what had happened to her, with Jeffrey Epstein, with that sort of dynamite photograph of herself with Prince Andrew, and Ghislaine Maxwell. When Virginia Giuffre, who had been kind of out of, she'd been living in Australia, she hadn't been around when Epstein was negotiating his plea deal. And so it's only when she and her kind of dynamite allegations come in and join that the class action lawsuit at the end of 2014, it's then that I think David Boies, who I know well, and another lawyer, Stan Pottinger, who's now passed away. But, these are big, well-known lawyers at a time when Brad Edwards wasn't. And they then come in really to help Brad Edwards, because I think they understood that this story was at some point going to explode. In fact, it would.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And by the way, even though I'm saying the lawsuits themselves, these new lawsuits don't contain any bold-faced names, well, the one in JP Morgan case didn't either, but it exposed a lot of information about one Jess Staley, was the former CEO of Barclays, high-ranking banker. And through the course of the litigation, we saw explosive emails between him and Epstein, him soaking apparently in Epstein's hot tub while Epstein was incarcerated, and allegations against him that emerged through that litigation. So I think it's something absolutely to watch. There's so much distracting. It will be very interesting to see whether these two lawsuits against major banking institutions, how much attention it gets, even in a news cycle that has been so saturated. Well, everyone's saying, where are the Epstein files? Where are the Epstein files? And yes, release the Epstein files. These are rather explosive Epstein files. They follow the public record, and that pay attention to who's covering this information today, because this is a new development to very much pay attention to for anyone who wants to demand some sort of justice.
And it will also, Adam, be very interesting to see if they settle quickly, because one of the things that was very interesting was that when this, same, Jane Doe, represented by same lawyers, actually, or at least one of them, sued JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank settled much more quickly than JP Morgan did. And, I have always wondered whether the general counsel of JP Morgan regretted in hindsight, because, yet again, I think the Senator Wyden is asking Jamie Dimon to come before Congress and explain what really went on in the bank. I mean, this wasn't good for him.
Yeah.
And so I guess, we'll see.
Absolutely. And the fact is, both of them did settle. It was a 9-figure settlement with...
They did, but not before all that discovery.
Absolutely.
Was very damaging, was made public. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what these two banks decide to do.
Right. And it'll be very interesting to see if Darren Indyke and Richard Kahn are taken to trial in that case. And if so, what emerges? It's really, people need to think about the mechanics. How did this operate? The government alleges in the estimate in even the Trump DOJ's filings is that there were more than 1,000 victims and survivors. If there are more than 1,000 on the global scale, how does that happen without vast sums of money, a sophisticated accounting, corporate structure?
Yes, and I will say this, that morally, I know that, we're talking about the legal system, which exists for valid and sensible reasons. But morally, I have struggled with the idea that Epstein's longtime lawyer and Epstein's longtime accountant are just able to walk around scot-free just because of because legally they've managed to find a way to get immunity in order to now, all these years later, pay these victims. It seems, I don't know. I have struggled with that, I
Yeah.
got to
Well,
say.
especially if and folks should the lawsuit against them is a public document. It accuses them of arranging sham marriages to keep victims closer to Epstein, and that there was a professional class that allowed the proximity to victims, a payment of victims according to the lawsuit. That's what's at stake in these civil cases. And that's what Darren Indyke and Richard Kahn settled with the Virgin Islands. With I think you mentioned, was it $105 million settlement? In order to make that case go away, we'll see what happens with this one. We'll see what emerges, but when that it takes it out of the realm of how does industrial scale sexual abuse happen? And
Yeah.
that's the thread that these lawsuits are pulling. And that's something that goes beyond the name or list of names that the public
Right.
is demanding. What was the nature of the relationship between Jean-Luc Brunel and Jeffrey Epstein, and who wired what through what instrument with whom, and who saw what was going on at a time there was a wealth of information about it and decided to look the other way. That's what these lawsuits are getting at. And it doesn't rely that when Senator Wyden talks about the follow the money investigation, well, it doesn't rely on the untrustworthy testimony of someone like, for example, Ghislaine Maxwell.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
can see the recipient and sender follow a trail, and that tells it, and what were the communications that may have been stored. It gives a more complete picture that right now we see the Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking conspiracy through various different keyholes of and valuable perspectives, because it's humanizing. It tells what it looked like on the ground, but what had to happen? How many people had to participate in order for abuse on that scale to occur?
Yeah. Well, watch this space. You know, as soon as we are done, I will be calling up those complaints, Adam, and also by this time next week, I will have read Virginia Roberts' memoir, and it'll be interesting to see what's in that, and if in any way we can complete more of the jigsaw puzzle.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
So meanwhile, and also breaking news, I read, as I'm sure you have, there's a grand jury convened around John Bolton.
Mm.
So I guess wait, that'll be breaking news. John Bolton, yet another of Trump's high profile enemies. James Comey and Letitia James indictments. I did read the Letitia James indictment, and I was like, I mean, they're going after her. I mean, we talked about $14,000 in the world of Jeffrey Epstein being peanuts, but I mean, you read this complaint against Letitia James, and you just like, come on. I
Right.
mean,
I mean, if you read nothing else from the indictment but the alleged criminal proceeds, right after the indictment, I spoke to Harry Littman, wonderful legal commentator friend and also a former federal prosecutor, former U.S. attorney. But when he was in the Eastern District of Virginia, he was an assistant U.S. attorney. And he said, and every former federal prosecutor who I've ever spoken to has said, that's not the amount of money that one builds a federal case over, unless, of course, you're an enemy of Donald Trump and you hollow out all of the career prosecutors and throw a rookie in for the express purpose of going after a person. That there was a fascinating story in the New York Times yesterday that made a bit of a splash, and it's related to all of this. It's the New York Times pointed out that apparently, without any public attention, earlier this year in the summer, in August, the Trump DOJ fired a U.S. attorney in the Western District of Virginia. So here we
I
have two.
saw this. Someone
Yeah.
clearing. Yes.
And again, we have a U.S. attorney who is a Republican, and this time an elected Republican. He was a former prominent House legislator, I believe, Speaker of the House in the state of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And he is urged, if not commanded by the powers that be in the Justice Department and Kash Patel in the FBI, hey, look into this case in order to discredit the Russia investigation, because Trump is still trying to discredit the Russia's documented attack on the 2016 presidential election, rewrite the history of that. Through his investigation, this former U.S. attorney, Todd Gilbert.
Oh, so this is different. Okay, this is right. Go on. Yeah.
He doesn't think that it warrants a grand jury investigation, tells Main Justice that, and aides to Todd Blanche and Pam Bondi are frustrated with the answer, and they blame a 20-year prosecutor under him who's also doubtful that there's any there. And they urge they urge Todd Gilbert to sideline this subordinate. He refuses. He is ousted. And in a really colorful detail, the New York Times notes that he posts an Anchorman meme. Boy, that escalated quickly because he spent about a month in office. So we have another picture emerging of a prosecutor who, with staunchly conservative background, seeing there's no there's no evidence to warrant a grand jury investigation, and he's purged. And by the way, unlike with James Comey and Letitia James, this time it seems like the investigation totally peters out. So without any of our attention, notice, because it was happening behind the scenes, in August, there was going to be this politically motivated investigation, but for prosecutors of integrity who refused to push it because there wasn't a there. And when I see a false equivalency being drawn about, oh, this is just revenge. This is just Trump doing to the other side what the other side did to him. This has never happened before. You've never had a president openly demand an investigation to his rivals. Biden never did that. There's never been any evidence of that. There's been the only thing that has ever been reported about Biden's thoughts on the investigations of Trump are about what Biden said privately, and that reporting says he never spoke to Merrick Garland about it. But what we have here is a pattern of Trump pressuring out any resistance in multiple districts across the country, over forcing people to either out of their position or to ignore what their career prosecutors are saying about it being bogus, and demanding criminal prosecutions immediately. And contrast that to what happened to Trump. Even the civil investigation of him took. I looked this up before we jumped on this. Michael Cohen testified to Congress in 2019 about Trump's taxes. It took 3 years for a lawsuit. 4 years for a lawsuit in the civil fraud case even to come to fruition. This is Trump demanding as quickly as possible that the systems of justice be weaponized against his enemies. And that this with the, I think that there are early signs that both of these cases will absolutely collapse. You have in James Comey, he filed a notice that he's going to try to disqualify Lindsay Halligan as the U.S. attorney in the case as improperly appointed. That kind of motion has been successful in 2 other districts where there have been invalid appointments. There, before even getting to the case, and we can talk about.
Well,
Yeah.
there was another thing right in that case where the judge has denied the government's. I don't if it was a motion. I think it was a motion that to arguing that James Comey himself couldn't keep discovery because it was too sensitive to be in his hands. And his counsel, Patrick Fitzgerald, pushed back and said, not so. My client needs to be able to see this material to prepare effectively for the trial. And I think that the judge has agreed with Comey and co.
Right.
And I, did note last week on, the fact that this judge, Nachmanoff, also is clearly pushing for this trial to be, expedited. I think is also very telling, right?
Right. Well, I mean, the Eastern District of Virginia is known to be very fast. It's known as a rocket docket, and he's definitely not standing in the way of all expedition in that. But it was interesting. One detail that Lawrence O'Donnell had picked up on from Jim Comey's arraignment, and I think it's a very telling detail. He pointed out that it was Lindsay Halligan's first time in court in a criminal case acting as a prosecutor, and everyone's registering their appearances for the record, and she's the only. Her assistants say that, here for the United States. Patrick Fitzgerald says, Patrick Fitzgerald, and it's the honor of my life to represent James Comey. And Lindsay Halligan just says 2 words, her name. Lindsay Halligan, because she's not here for the United States. And that's the thing, it's interesting. Trump gets a headline. He gets that there is an indictment of James Comey. There almost was not an indictment of James Comey because the grand jury demolished the first count. They rejected it out of hand. And the grand jury, by the thinnest of margins, and it became public that 14 out of 23 voted on the other 2 counts, which were not supposed to be the heart of the case. In the Letitia James case, we found out through reporting in the New York Times that a grand jury in Norfolk, Virginia, had heard testimony from Letitia James's niece that undercut the heart of the government's case, saying that I never paid her.
She didn't pay her on any rent. She was living there, right, and not paying any rent.
Absolutely. And the heart of Ms. Halligan's case is that this was an investment home, and she did not call the niece before the grand jury. It's depriving that grand jury of pretty key information. If you're saying, well, you defrauded a banking institution to get a loan because this is actually an investment home, and the investment is you let your niece stay there without pay, as family, it's the brazenness is just so out in the open, and that it's just
You know what? You know what would be an interesting exercise, Adam? I don't know if there's a way to do this, but is to try to calculate how much these various prosecutions and trials are actually costing the US taxpayer.
Right.
Because actually, the one thing Trump really understands is money. and, and I mean, I wonder if there was a way if you calculated that, all the everybody's pay, the time, I mean, there must be some way to get a rough estimate.
Right.
Um,
Well,
I mean,
there was an interesting thing that because of the special counsel statutes, we had that running tally with the Trump cases. And what Trump is very good at, he's media savvy. And he's,
right,
this is a waste of money. They're going after me. And I think what is so much more urgent in my mind at this time is shelving the phony equivalency. And I looked
right,
at the Washington Post that the entire editorial board goes with this false equivalence that they recognize the James Comey case for what it is, but they go out of the way to say that this is just like Jack Smith having access to phone data about the calls that Trump and Giuliani made to elected officials. And I wonder if they spoke to a single Justice Beat reporter. I don't know any serious journalist who covers the Justice Department who knows what the difference between a wiretap as is bogusly described um, uh, by by one senator, Josh Hawley, and the phone metadata that would
right,
explain uh,
right.
Jack Smith's interest and need for evidence authorized by a grand jury in that particular case, given the allegations of the indictment. Did anyone from what was once esteemed as a
Right.
paper of record of the United States, they bother to speak to someone who knows the Justice Department, the ins and outs of it, and say, "Hey, do you think that this equivalency washes? Are these things at all analogous with each other?" And it's just nonsense. And I think there are enough voices saying no, these things aren't similar,
No,
but I
no,
also think that the the reason for that hasn't been clearly communicated because no, Biden did not hollow out everyone who stood in the way of the Trump prosecution. All of these prosecutions resulted from years-long investigations that frustrated even the then president of the United States. That frustrated a lot of members of the general public because this is how the criminal process usually operates. It's slow. A investigation develops because it needs to stand up both in front of a jury and on appeal. There weren't crowds of people experiencing crises of conscience within the Justice Department and leaving in droves, telling people about the corruption of their districts and their profession. None of that ever happened. And to
well, and let's not forget that even though at the end of the day, Joe Biden reneged on what he'd said and pardoned his son,
right.
he did let that was his constitutional right. I mean, it was, I think, distasteful to a lot of people. And it will probably tarnish Joe Biden's legacy when the history books are written. But he did at least let his own son go through the legal process and suffer the consequences of that.
Right, and
And
they're not even
yes,
letting, uh, Tom Homan face
right,
any kind of scrutiny about the $50,000. Now, let's say that you think, "Well, okay, he shouldn't have been, prosecuted for bribery." Let's say you believe the administration with that. Shouldn't he face questions about that $50,000 that no one denies he took in taxpayer money? That's the level of shielding of friends that this government is doing. That you have, every single member of the Trump White House going to bat and saying that there's something improper to ask, hey, this taxpayer money handed by the FBI on camera to your guy, what happened to the money? They have turned that into some sort of controversial question rather than the most basic kind of accountability. The equivalency is shocking, but not.
It's at times like this where I wish that the American political system had something equivalent to the British parliamentary system. Because if this was going on in Britain, there would be such fiery debate in the Houses of Parliament. And you would be hearing repeatedly from the opposition their outrage, and you'd probably be hearing because these are all people who are skilled in debate, really good arguments along the lines that you've made about why this is not remotely equivalent, why it's dangerous, etc., etc. And I feel like in the system we have, that all gets lost.
Right. Right. And it's amazing how much through sheer force of repetition, I think that Trump has been very skilled at figuring out that repetition for many people trumps any sort of
Yeah.
evidence, any sort of persuasion, that you just need to say that there's something wrong about asking, hey, what happened to the $50,000 in taxpayer money? Did he declare it on tax forms if that
Yeah.
was legitimate income? And how would that possibly be legitimate income, getting that from undercover agents? He's found that if he says something, and forget about Trump, if, half a dozen or more congressional Republicans gin up a bogus controversy about Jack Smith supposedly spying on senators, that, well, an average person might think, well, maybe if that many
Maybe he
people
did.
are saying that,
Yeah.
maybe there's something wrong there. Because it takes a long time to explain what tolling records are and how it's metadata and how it related to the January 6th investigation and what were the restrictions on that. Were they used in any way against these lawmakers? What's the speech and debate clause? That takes unpacking. But if you say, this person did something wrong, this person did something wrong, it's sort of in the same way you have Attorney General Pam Bondi saying over and over again, the Antifa terrorists. How many folks who know that there's no such thing in U.S. law as a domestic terrorist organization? I am sure that Pam Bondi has repeated that
Mm.
Antifa, a ideology that does not exist as a concrete organization, is a domestic terrorist organization. The people who point out those very clear facts are outnumbered in the sheer
Yeah.
number of mentions and repetitions, that by the folks who are pretending, A, that such a organization as Antifa exists, and B, that there exists such a thing under US law as a domestic terrorism organization. And that perception matters because the more people believe, well, I don't want to align with
Yeah.
terrorism because, even if I believe that Antifa, even anti-fascism sounds good to me. I'm not a fascist,
Yeah.
but even folks who think that it intimidates, because if
Yeah.
the government says confidently that we can go after groups that we have declared terrorist organizations, that creates a chilling effect, even if there is no such thing because of the First Amendment of the Constitution. We have freedom of association in the United States, and so under the law, no matter how many times Trump and Pam Bondi want to will it into existence, they cannot use a domestic terrorism law that doesn't exist to go after the people and ideas that they disfavor. And the people who are getting that particular message out I think their voices are very much drowned out by the sheer force of repetition that a thing
Yeah.
called Antifa exists and that there's a made up law that's going to be used to combat them. It creates a climate of fear, even if they don't have the power to act on it.
Agreed. Well, on one positive note, very good news, and I would have been horrified if it hadn't gone this way, that the Supreme Court refused to hear Alex Jones' appeal. And he was appealing, for anyone who doesn't know, he was appealing the ruling against him, demanding that he pay, I think it was 1.4 billion. I'm not sure the exact amount, but up there, rightly so in my mind, to the parents of the Sandy Hook victims, which he claimed was a hoax.
Mhm.
I personally am delighted that the Supreme Court decided not to hear his appeal. Just quickly, because we're almost out of time. I don't know what we're now obviously nearly at 6:00. I haven't seen the latest headlines about what the Supreme Court has decided to do with voter registration. Do we know?
They just heard oral arguments over the Voting Rights Act. I caught a good portion of those oral arguments, and it looks just like many people predicted from the start we're going to have a partisan split, whether it's 6-3. I mean, who knows? You can't always judge from questioning, but it seems very clear that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act could, at minimum, be weakened. And there have been experts in the field of voting rights that have warned that an adverse ruling that weakens the Voting Rights Act's Section 2 against diluting minority voting power could have a major effect on Capitol Hill. Republicans can draw, by one estimate, 19 new House seats, cement control for a generation, according to Fair Fight. So we'll see what happens with the ruling. It's going to take some time. Usually there's
Right. And I
months.
think I read everywhere as to you that timing on this is also important. Well, whether they may, if they wait months, then whatever they decide won't affect the midterms. If they just, and that's more likely, I
Right.
believe. But yeah,
But
you know,
on your question about Alex Jones, it's Alex Jones came in really hot with his petition, saying that this is a major First Amendment case, that there are several issues of constitutional importance, and the Supreme Court just said denied. And that he's like many litigants, saying that this is a very important case for the Supreme Court to consider. And at the end of the day, there was nothing to consider. There was no First Amendment issue because the interesting thing was the trials that we saw, those were damages trials because he refused to take part in discovery. He defaulted on the judgment. So there's no First Amendment issues. And, even if it did go to a defamation trial, there, it's it's unthinkable that Alex Jones at some point didn't know that the Sandy Hook massacre wasn't staged. It's impossible to think that Alex Jones didn't know that he was tormenting those families and that
right,
he was tarnishing the
right,
legacy of their murdered children and
right,
slandering people like the heroic FBI agent Bill Aldenberg, who tearfully testified about what he witnessed in that scene of a slaughter. So
right.
no, there wasn't a First Amendment issue. He got what a
Exactly. The
lot of
standard. I mean, yeah, I've had David Enrich, the New York Times investigative journalist, on here talk because he recently published a book about this. But the standard, if you're a journalist and you're, talking about someone or something high profile, is, it is about intent, and it's did you mean to do it, and was it willfully? It's malicious, right?
right.
And And in this case, he was absolutely intentional, and it was malicious.
Right.
I mean,
The interesting thing is he forfeited the right to argue that it wasn't because
yeah,
he defied court orders and didn't give the families discovery. So he didn't even have he didn't get that far because he thumbed his nose at the process. And I'll say this, that it's like, even folks, I mean, Alex Jones is a conspiracy theorist who's not, and I don't think of him as a kind of, I think journalists generally are very skeptical of of advocating for outcomes that make people able to bankrupt people
yeah,
for what they view as speech. But I don't know any single serious journalist who thinks that this is
yeah.
a that
This is
this
not the
is
issue to end sleepover. So,
no. That what Alex Jones did was so out of bounds and was
yeah,
so depraved that there isn't a world where a journalist would knowingly torment a family by claiming a disaster everyone witnessed.
no, and I haven't seen. Look, I'm not tuned in to Fox News all day and night, but I'm not aware that journalists on the right have been
No, not
um,
at all.
banging the drum for him.
And
Yeah,
as a matter of fact, even Todd Blanche stopped Ed Martin, the so-called weaponization guy. Ed Martin tried to go to bat for Alex Jones, and get and harass the FBI agent I mentioned earlier, who had testified on behalf of the families, the Sandy Hook victims' families, and and Todd Blanche apparently set him straight, saying, "Why are you embarrassing the administration for this fringe activist? Too fringe even for Todd Blanche to intervene on his behalf." So he ends this litigation in the same disgrace that has trailed him throughout it.
wow, Adam, we've burnt through an hour. We could probably easily burn through another one, but we should
I'm
probably
sure.
start. It's great. I'm so great, to have you back, because I feel like people really value your analysis. I certainly do. And there's a never-ending supply of things for us to talk about. Thank you.
Absolutely mutual, Vicky. I always enjoy our conversations.
We'll see you very soon.
See you
Take
soon.
care.
Take care. Bye bye.